Hi guys, welcome back to the channel. So in today's edition of Clown World, Canada has entered the chat with women's powerlifting, allowing a biological male, a transgender athlete, to compete in the female category. And this transgender athlete has broken several records in the women's category for powerlifting. And when you look at the record that was held by a female and the record that this person holds, that this male holds, it's ridiculous. It's not even close, to the point that you cannot justify allowing this. You cannot tell me that this person does not have an unfair advantage, and it's making a mockery of powerlifting. It's making a mockery of this female category. So Riley Gaines is somebody who has spoken out against this. She has blasted Justin Trudeau for allowing trans-identified males into women's sports, for basically destroying women's sports. So let's take a look at this person in action. Now, when I've seen powerlifting, usually the person drops the weight because they've really exhausted all of their energy. This person just casually lowers it back down because they barely broke a sweat. So let's take a look at the story. Riley Gaines, an advocate for women's sports, called out Canada Prime Minister Justin Trudeau after a trans woman set a national and unofficial world record in powerlifting on Sunday. So this person is Anne Andreas and set the national record, but it was by so much that unofficially is greater than the world record for women's powerlifting. So if this person goes international, they're going to ruin the category worldwide. Anne Andreas, a 40-year-old biological male who identifies as a woman, who currently holds multiple powerlifting records in the female division, was competing at the Canadian Powerlifting Union's 2023 Western Canadian Championship on Sunday in the female masters unequipped category, when she blew out her opponents. Her total weight, lifted in squat, bench and deadlift, resulted in a final score of 597.5 kilograms, which was over 200 kilograms more than her closest opponent, Suzanne Gill, who finished at 387.5 kilograms. So in the women's category, no woman is going to outlift somebody by 200 kilograms. That doesn't happen. Just like with Leah Thomas, you're seeing them beat people in sprints by seconds, which doesn't happen. It's impossible. Except for when the person is male and they're competing against women. With that total, Andreas set a new Canadian women's national record at the championship, while it also being an unofficial women's world record. In response, Gaines took to social media to blast Trudeau's policies, which allow the Canadian Powerlifting Union, CPU, to have a gender self-identification trans inclusion policy announced earlier this year that allows males to participate in women's competitions based on gender alone. Wow. So the ICFS said the following: "This is not a legitimate national record. This is a mediocre lift by a mediocre male who is being allowed to lift against women because hair color? That's all it takes to become a woman. Just change your hair color, or grow your hair, or put on some makeup or some nails. So that's all it takes to become a woman. Shame on the Canadian Powerlifting Union. This is discrimination against the female competitors. Absolutely."
5. This will be a national record.
Acting like it's such an effort. And they make a good point. It's always the mediocre males who couldn't make it against other men who now go over into women's sports. change their hair color or grow their hair, and they can identify as a woman and now dominate and break records that will never be broken again by a female, unless she's on steroids or something. These records will never be broken again by a female. 200 kilograms difference, to the point where the world record was even beaten. And you think a female's going to come along and be able to compete with that? It makes women's sports null and void. And I don't know what this Trudeau is doing, because he is so intent on pushing this woke agenda that he's willing to destroy women's sports. So good on Riley Gaines for calling him out. Now, thank goodness the UK is getting it right in some areas. They've banned biological males competing in women's rowing, for example, and swimming. Worldwide, transgender athletes are not allowed to compete in the female category. So Leah Thomas can't go and ruin the Olympics. Leah Thomas can't go and ruin the World Championships. Because this person, if this continues, technically they can go into the Olympics, into the World Championships, and ruin the records there. So what do women have to aspire to in those categories now? If this transgender athlete's record stands, how can a woman one day dream of beating that record? When realistically, it's not going to happen unless they take performance-enhancing drugs. I don't really see how, a natural woman, a natural-born female, is going to beat these records. They're going to be there till the end of time and only be beaten by another trans-identified male competing in the women's category. That's the only hope that there is for this record being beaten, is for another male to come along and beat it. So where do the women get a look in that situation? They don't. Riley went on to say, Trudeau's radical disdain for women and reality was in effect. So apparently Andreas even mocked female athletes.
Breaking news, there is a new Canadian national record holder in women's powerlifting. The only problem is, it wasn't set by a woman. Trans-identified Anne Andres competed at the 2023 Western Canadian Championships yesterday. According to results, Andres' total powerlifting score was over 210 pounds more than the top-performing female in the same class. Not only is this a Canadian national record, sources say that this is an unofficial world record for the class that Andres competed in. And as if his domination competing against the women wasn't enough, watch as he mocks female powerlifters.
Why is women's bench so bad? I mean, not compared to me. We all know that I'm a tranny freak, so that doesn't count. And no, we're not talking about Mackenzie Lee. She's got little T-Rex arms and she's like 400 pounds of chest muscle, apparently. I mean, standard bench in powerlifting competition for women, I literally don't understand why it's so bad.
Let's rephrase that. Women's bench might be bad to you because you are a male who's gone through male puberty with a male amount of testosterone. Being a woman or a female athlete doesn't mean we're inferior or not capable of accomplishing incredible things, but it means we're different to men. And that's exactly why the women's sporting category was ever even created. And we deserve to be recognized and celebrated based off of those physical ceilings and our own uniqueness. Andre's record is a mediocre lift by a mediocre male powerlifter because the Canadian Powerlifting Union is discriminating against female athletes.
And Andreas is the same person who was humiliated by another man, a man who knows he's a man, who came along and basically destroyed their bench lift competition and unofficially won it. Remember that? I'm sure that was very humiliating for Anne. Think about the female athletes who have to sit there and watch you destroy their record, watch you destroy their competition, and then mock them and say that, they're so bad. How ridiculous. And as Riley said, women athletes aren't inferior. They're just built differently. So therefore, everyone needs to stay in their category to ensure that sports remains fair. Just like a teenager is built differently from a grown man. They don't compete against one another. But that teenager could probably run circles around that man in 5 years' time. But initially, while that child is still growing, they compete with other children. That's what keeps it fair. An able-bodied person doesn't compete in the Paralympics. That doesn't mean that the Paralympics is inferior. It means that people stick with their categories that make sense. It means that people stick with reality. And we have another female athlete here who actually competes in powerlifting, who spoke out against what this federation is doing.
Yeah, so Anne actually just broke the national records for all the master records yesterday while competing at the Western regions. He also holds the second highest deadlift in our powerlifting federation of all time, of all ages. We're talking 20 and up. He just turned 40, so he is a 40-year-old, 6 foot, 250-pound man. And, you know, it's been very disheartening. For example, that national record that he broke, athletes have been chasing that for years. And we're talking top athletes who have been training and training and training. You know, so it just goes to show the advantages, the physiological advantages that a male has over a female, whether it's muscle mass or bone density, lung capacity. You know, I could go on, but it's been very disheartening. A lot of women actually yesterday dropped out of the competition because they knew that Anne would be lifting. So they dropped, they quit, they wrote to the federation, and the federation basically did nothing about it.
And it's heartbreaking to hear of female athletes dropping out of the competition because they have to compete with a man. They have to compete against a man who's built differently from them. And they know that they can't compete. They can't compete against that. So they're the ones being pushed out of a sport that is designed for them. They are the ones being pushed out of a sport that they have worked hard for, that they have built their bodies up to reach that level. They're the ones being pushed out of it. It reminds me of the cycling. And again, thank goodness, transgender athletes aren't allowed to compete in, you know, cycling competitions now. But the Belgian waffle event, there was a female athlete who retired early because she didn't want to deal with it. This was a top female athlete who left the sport that she loves, retired early, so she wouldn't have to deal with this.
Women's cycling champion Hannah Rensman quit the sport after losing to controversial transgender competitor Austin Killitz in December, abandoning her dream of competing at the Paris Olympics in 2024. Footage from that race shows Killitz shoving a Rensman, causing outrage that the 6-foot-tall, very muscular-born male used intimidation to get ahead. But last weekend, Austin Killitz won another race in North Carolina by 5 entire minutes. In a moment, I'll get the view of former Olympic swimming champion and author of a new book, Unfair Play, Sharon Davis. But first, I'm joined by Hannah Rensman from United States. Hannah, when you see just that bit of footage there, the brutal way he was sort of shoved away, but in a way, that's kind of what's happening in women's sport generally, right? A bunch of trans athletes have come along and are shoving biological females out the way.
Absolutely. It's very disheartening to see in all sorts of levels. It's not just the elite. It's also every level, starting from open women all the way up. So, yeah, it's very sad.
Hannah, you've actually quit the sport, which is incredibly depressing that you've been forced to do this. Why did you come to that decision?
There were multiple reasons, but it was definitely very disheartening to leave my last race and be flanked on either side of the national cyclocross championship by 2 men in the elite women's race.
And these are men who are now trans women, but they're biological men. And this is an issue now not just affecting cycling, but we're seeing it in all sorts of other sports. Do you feel, Hannah, obviously it's such a hot topic, it's so incendiary, very few people want to put their heads over the parapet. Do you feel a lot of female athletes and sportswomen share your view, but are just too intimidated to say it?
Yes, lots, even in the cycling community, which on the front looks very pro guys racing in our field, but the women quietly try to find ways to let their voice be heard by either contacting the governing bodies or just trying to make other people aware around that this is not okay. It's not fair And biologically, you can never make it fair.
It's completely unfair. Well, thank you very much indeed. And I'm just so sorry about what's happened to you.
I'm very curious to see who are in these federations. Is it a bunch of men, or is it a bunch of feminists who are okay with seeing the downfall of female athletes so they can include transgender athletes and be progressive? Probably a mixture of both. I mean, I'm wondering if the only way to address this is if the female athletes just refuse to compete. Let Andreas compete by himself. Let him compete by himself. I honestly believe that's the only way that this is going to be addressed, especially in countries like Canada, where they're really going all out. They're really going all out with this thing, and they're willing to destroy women's sports in the process. I mean, at this point, the female athletes have nothing else to lose. But if these female athletes stick together and basically refuse to compete against a man, then we might see some progress. Because without these female athletes, there is no sports in this category. I don't care how many, biological males enter into that competition. Nobody's going to want to watch that. So again, I commend Riley Gaines. I commend the athletes who are speaking out. The female athletes who are brave enough to say this isn't right. The female athletes who are brave enough to risk being called transphobic. At this point, these labels are meaningless. These labels just mean that you're in touch with reality. That's what these labels have become. So I would hope that the fear of being labelled isn't going to stop these female athletes making a stand against this. They need to refuse to compete against the likes of Anne Andreas, who are basically cheaters. This is cheating. There's no way around that. So let me know what you think. Thanks for watching. Take care of yourselves, and God willing, I will see you in the next video.